Hey everyone, if we haven't met, my name is Jonathan Carone and I'm the host of Healthy Sports Parents. I wanted to start the show a little differently than normal this week to give you some context for this episode. If you're listening as this comes out, you know that this weekend is Easter, and this year is one of those years where both the mainline and evangelical Easter lines up with the Greek and Eastern Orthodox Easter, so we're all celebrating that at the same time this year. Because of that, and because we've had this question asked a lot, I wanted to do an episode on how we balance travel sports and the Christian faith, specifically because so many tournaments take us away from church on the weekend. For those of you who aren't a part of a church or you don't have Christian beliefs, I want to let you know that this podcast is not an explicitly Christian podcast. It's not going to be faith-based every single week or even most weeks. But that is part of my background. If you've read my bio on the website, I have a ministry degree and I've worked in a church, I've worked in sports. So tying all of this together is a large part of what my life has been about. And since so many have asked the questions about it, I wanted to answer those questions. We'll be back next week with a non-religious topic. So if you want to skip this week, I totally understand that. I do think there are some good nuggets that are worth listening to in this episode, but I absolutely get it if you skip this episode. Joining me today is my pastor, Johnny Pereira. You'll hear more about his kids as we go through the show, but he's got one kid who is an athlete in college right now and another who is finishing up their senior year of high school and were an athlete throughout high school as well. So he's walked this journey that most of us, or many of us, if you're listening, probably most of us, that we're on right now. We talk about balancing sports and church, making sure our identity is found in Jesus and not in the sports our kids play, and how to prepare our kids for life outside of our house as they grow up. It's a touch longer than normal, but hopefully you'll enjoy listening as much as I enjoyed recording it. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and get to my conversation with Pastor Johnny Pereira. We're here with Pastor Johnny Pereira. Johnny, go ahead and say hi to everybody.
Hey, everybody. Good to be with you, Jonathan.
So before we get to all the things that make you qualified for today, the thing we do in every episode is we want to meet Dad first. So can you tell
Yeah.
us about your kids, what they play, and what it's like being dad to them?
Yeah, I would love to. My wife and I, Lori, have two kids. So we have a daughter, Lily, and this is surreal saying this. She's 20 years old. And we have a son, Lucas, who is 17 years old. So Lily is a sophomore in college down at Florida Southern in Central Florida, and Lucas is a senior in high school. So my wife and I are trying to wrestle and think about like what does it look like with both kids now out of high school and our lives have been going to sporting events ever since they were a little kid. So we've realized that we have no hobbies right now outside of attending sporting events.
So what do each of them play? I kind of know this, but let's give a peek behind the curtain
Yeah.
for everybody else.
Yeah, so Lily's, when she was in middle school, she played volleyball and basketball, and then in high school, she kind of concentrated. That's where she really focused in on basketball. So she's, as I said, she's currently at Florida Southern, and she's on a full scholarship. She plays basketball there. Um, so her personality would be more like my wife. So she's a super high achiever, competitive. But thankfully, she has my wife's personality and the fact that she's very nurturing in her personality as well. Lucas is, he played all sports growing up. I mean, basketball, baseball, football. And then he really focused on in high school in football. I think part of that is he didn't want to do what his sister did. And so he played football. We just finished up his senior season. So that was amazing. And personality is probably more like myself. So high achiever, competitive. So we have a very competitive, high achieving household. But Lucas is a bit more analytical and loves to solve problems. But yeah, it's so that's we know what it's like to be parents whose kids are involved in sports for sure.
Lily had an interesting decision. We'll get into the church stuff here in a minute, but I want to focus in on this just for a second because I know Lily ended up transferring high schools
Hmm.
and going to a school that was better for her basketball career. And I know that as parents as their kids get older and scholarship opportunities start to kind of like, what do I do? How do I position
Hmm.
my kid the best way? Can you talk just for a minute about what
Yeah.
went into you all making the shift for her? Because she ended up going to school, probably high school, like 25 minutes away from you all, so that she'd have a
Yeah.
better basketball opportunity.
So it was going into her sophomore year that she came to us and said that she wants to take basketball more seriously and wants to work towards playing basketball in college. And I remember we sat down with her and emphasized that this has got to be her decision. We never really pressed that on her. We never really put that thought into her mind. As parents, I myself saw that maybe she could have that ability, but reflecting, in spite of really not receiving any counsel, so we just thank God did put that thought in her mind early. But she came to us, and so she signed up to be a part of a more competitive travel basketball team. So this was the summer. Uh, Man, I'm trying to remember. This was going into this would have been March of 2020. So we all know what happened around that time. And so COVID hit. No, obviously no travel basketball. She was going to Mount Tabor High School, which is a local public high school here. And we knew that they probably weren't going to have much of a basketball season, if any at all, and how that would impact her. And so I just made some phone calls of some schools in the area that were competitive in basketball, and at the same time, I knew possibly would have the opportunity to have more of a season. And so she went to a private school in High Point, which is, like you said, about 25 minutes from us. That as well, like we said, this has got to be your decision, and she's young for her age, so she has a summer birthday. And so we were advised as well, hey, for her development, it would probably be good for her to reclass. So she actually did another year of high school. And we made sure that that was her decision because, there's no guarantees on that any of this was going to lead to any type of scholarship opportunity. So, my point in sharing that is, man, we made sure that this was her decision, rather than a decision that we made for her, knowing, and she was fully aware of what that would cost. So outside of the financial implications for us, what it would cost her. And so she made that decision, and I think for us that was super important because if maybe things didn't work out the way that she thought they would, we just felt like it was really important for her to be able to reflect and say, no, this was my decision, and I'm content with it. And so for us, it worked. She really had a great experience.
We could have an entire episode on that idea,
Yeah,
but
for
we
sure.
do want to
Absolutely.
focus in on the topic for today. So I want to jump into that, and maybe we can swing back around to Lily's
Yeah.
journey towards the end. But like this episode's about balancing our faith and youth sports, and there's so many layers to that. But we know the question off the top of our head because you get asked this all the time. I've been asked this quite a bit. It's something I dealt with growing the grandson of a pastor in a much more fundamentalist time. And how do we balance weekend tournaments with being involved in church? And so I know my opinion. I think I
Hmm.
know yours, but as both my pastor and someone who has been through it,
Yeah.
if we come to you and tell you Olivia and Owen are doing travel tournaments in 5 years, we don't want to
Hmm.
miss too much, but this is an opportunity. How would you
Hmm.
counsel us or other parents?
Yeah. So I appreciate the question. So in thinking about this for ourselves, so I'll kind of share what we had to decide for us, because I think that's important so that it doesn't appear as though I'm preaching at anybody on the screen, but really just sharing advice and what helped us, and hopefully it can help parents out there as they discern this. I believe, as a pastor, but as a follower of Jesus, an important question. So we had to ask ourselves, first of all, this question: what are the values that we want our children to have when they become adults? So for us, that was a fundamental question that really we've thought of and tried to be intentional with way before sports ever came to the picture, and whether or not they do travel sports and miss a Sunday or a weekend or whatever. But what are the values I want my children to have when they become adults? So, I've seen enough of these podcasts, Jonathan, to know you've covered a great gamut. So I don't feel like I've got to feel like to fit everything in and as far as what I think. But, think about it. We want our kids in sports. We want them to know perseverance, right? To not run from doing hard things. We want them to understand teamwork. What does it look like to work with others, to achieve a common goal, to cheer one another on, to not be selfish? Those are obviously values that will carry them far beyond however long their athletic career lasts. But as well for us, man, we want them to have a faith in God and a love for God. So I would say for parents, just asking yourselves, hey, before we just decide like, hey, here's an opportunity, it's going to require us to have to, you know, miss, they play on Sundays. It's going to require us to miss, we have a love for God. We value our relationship with Jesus, but we're going to miss all these Sundays. Just take a step back and just ask yourselves, what are the values you want your children to have when they become adults? Because you can say whatever you want, but what you do is going to be absorbed a lot more by your kids than what you say. The second question we had to ask ourselves was, does our family schedule match what we value most? So what do we want our children to value when they become adults, but does our family schedule match what we say we value most? So let me give you some examples. So for us, our journey, and I know every kid's journey is different and every parent's journey is different, but for us, with Lily, and really with Lucas, we had them when they were little, I think 5 or 6 years old, when we were in Florida at the time, and we had them in YMCA leagues and all different types of things that were like, hey, a Saturday morning they play. It's competitive, but at the same time, it's not, they're not traveling around every weekend when they're 7 years old. So we just got them involved in everything. But then when Lily went to high school and got into actually competitive high level travel AAU, which by the way, we didn't start that till the summer between her sophomore and junior year. That's a whole nother topic we could talk about. But when we just said, hey, if you've got a Sunday tournament, which she did, at that level, you're playing Saturdays and Sundays and sometimes Friday nights. We just said, hey, we want to make sure that if you're not at the Sunday morning gathering, that we also want to make sure that you're not removing yourself from your community. So we said, hey, we're not gonna have you miss more than 2 Sundays in a row. That's what we decided. So, everybody wants you to say, tell me what to do. Well, we're not going to be legalistic with this. That's what we decided for us. And then the Sundays that she did miss, and there might have been times where she missed 3 in a row. I don't remember. But the Sundays that she did miss on a Sunday morning, we made sure that one of the things we did say is, hey, we want you to be a part of we call it Thrive here, but your youth group or youth ministry. For us, it met on Sunday night, some places Wednesday night, so that she was still connected to her community if she missed a weekend. So that was super important for us. On the Sundays we did miss, and let me just say, as a pastor, I also missed some Sundays. I'm just thankful I was at a church where our leadership structure understood the value of I can never get this time back. So the Sundays that we did miss, I really took advantage of conversations that I could have with her about life, about faith. Um, as your kids get older, you'll find out that you can't schedule meaningful conversations with them. It doesn't work. But meaningful conversations oftentimes happen in the car when you're driving somewhere. So I would take advantage of those. And then I really saw it as an opportunity for me to really get to know other people, other parents on her team. Um, that, and I didn't care if, I mean, I did care, but I mean, I actually loved that there was a lot of people that didn't have any faith. That was awesome. I wanted to get to know them. And hopefully they didn't ask me what I did for a living after the first conversation, so they ran and hid. But I wanted to get to know them. How could I encourage them? How could I pray for them? And, hey, if a gospel conversation came up, man, that's awesome as well. But I believe the church, when we think about the church, so I'm going to try not to get too theological, Jonathan, because that's not what this podcast is, but the word church means gathering. Okay. So there is an importance in the Bible of gathering together. That is a part of us following Jesus, but we're also called the church. So it's not just about me gathering together, but it's also about me understanding that when I walk out those doors, I have the opportunity to be the church. And so it's not just about what I'm being invested in when I gather the church, but also me asking, how can I use that and be mobilized to be a representative of the love of God that has changed me? So I like to say church is who you are, not just a place you go. Um, and so, for us, those were just some things. Now, Lucas, as I said, man, when he was playing really competitive football, the schedule just worked out. They didn't play on Sundays. So that was less of a conversation. But for us, we just said, hey, if we're going to miss some Sundays, and my daughter missed Sundays more than I do because that's my busiest day with my occupation. I wanted to make sure that she didn't separate herself from some type of gathering that could provide community for her, encouragement for her, and still make sure that she saw that we believe that this is a value that is essential for her life, understanding that ultimately that's her decision. But for us, just to reflect, what are the values I want my children to have when they become adults, and does our family schedule match what we say we value most? I grew up in a culture much like you growing up, right? Where I didn't get the opportunity to do any travel sports because, I love my parents to death, but missing a Sunday was off the table. Where I just approach it and I actually encourage people in the church as well. Hey, God still loves you if you miss a Sunday. I would just say, hey, let's make sure that what you're doing though doesn't contradict what you say you value with your kids and with your household.
One of the things I love about what we're doing as a church, and this is kind of a weird spot for me because I typically have my sport management coaching hat on this
Right,
podcast, but
exactly.
then so this episode I'm also putting that master's in student ministry on as well, and with my business I work with, so it's like I'm in this weird spot of my brain's in a thousand places right now. But one of the things I love about what we do as a church is the emphasis on, the technical term is the priesthood of the believer, but
Hmm.
basically the layman's term of that is that as Christians, we have the ability to go out and have gospel conversations and gospel centered relationships with people outside of the Sunday morning service. And one of the things we talk about a lot, I use different language than you do, but we are called to gather with people, but it doesn't necessarily always have to be as part of the 501c3 nonprofit organization known as the local church in America. A Bible study amongst parents at a basketball
Hmm.
tournament counts just as much for gathering together as believers as going to a church on a Sunday morning. It probably shouldn't be your only gathering, but I think the way you and I grew up, we were probably taught that's a junior varsity version of gathering.
Hmm.
When in reality, around the breakfast table at the hotel on a Sunday morning before our game while we're talking about Jesus counts just as much as showing up in a pair of khaki pants and a polo shirt to sing 3 hymns and listen to a sermon.
Right. Yeah. I appreciate you saying that. Um, as you being a part of our church, it means you're listening. Uh, um, but I think for us, I mean, that's our heartbeat. And I don't know who's listening on what each person's context is of church. I know there would be many, but as far as our conviction, once again, not to get too theological, the church just isn't about gathering together, even though that's what the church means. There's also in Ephesians 4 responsibility that when we gather, we are to equip the saints for the work of the ministry. So for us, when we gather, let it be purposeful that we are equipping people to be able to know how to, if an opportunity presents itself, to be able to have a small gathering in a hotel lobby to start the morning and actually know how to, say, hey, here's a way to read the Bible, and
While not
here's
making it super weird. Like it doesn't have
exactly.
to be.
Yeah, which to just that scenario right there probably has people even having anxiety thinking
You
about it.
don't have to break out the acoustic guitar and play Oceans or something like that
No.
in the middle of the lobby for it to count. It can literally just be conversations.
Yeah, and so I mean, we've been a part of teams where um, they've offered. Obviously, it wasn't required, but for certain people, they wanted that, and so um, and I loved to be in an environment, frankly, where they didn't look to me to lead it, but it was awesome to be able to have those types of things. So for us, we really want to equip people that if those conversations or should I say opportunities come up, they actually know how to embrace those. So yeah, it goes. That's why I say the church isn't just a place you go, it's who you are. You take it with you. And so to me, if I was hearing stories from parents who are actually stepping into those opportunities, man, that's a win for us versus just, hey, you sat in a seat and listened to me teach. And I'm not trying to minimize that, but at the same time, I don't think it's an either or, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so we've talked a little bit about the church service piece of it, but when we balance our faith in sports, it's so much bigger than just the Sunday morning. It's so much more involved than just the gathering. One of the pieces that I talk a lot about on social and on here on the show, I talk about identity a lot, and there is a core piece of my motivation for that because I understand identity in Jesus. And I try not to beat people over the head with it because I know we have people from all sorts of faith backgrounds who are a part of this community. And but the idea of not putting our identity in our kids' sports is a healthy one across the board. But since we're talking specifically this week about the Christian faith, I would love for you to give us a crash course on what our identity is and why it's so important for us to not put our identity in sports. And that includes both our kids' identity in sports and our identity as being a sports parent. Yes, it's part of what we are, but that's not the whole identity of who we are completely at the core.
Yeah. Huge, fundamental piece. So I love that you're wanting to emphasize that, Jonathan. So let me give a comparison and contrast to what the Bible says my identity is and what I believe culture tells me my identity is. So if we look at the Bible, and this is a vast topic, so if you want chapters and verses, you can reach out to Jonathan. I'd be more than happy to send you some. But the Bible says my identity is who God says I am. Culture tells me my identity is what I do. So those are two very fundamental differences. So the Bible says my identity is who God says I am. So God has created every man, woman, and child in the image of God. That's what makes us different than any other creation. Um, and I also am loved by God. and I receive that love through Jesus and his performance for me, not my own. So his life and death and resurrection for me, not my own. So let's just think about that in terms of what culture says, and frankly, what we oftentimes tell ourselves. So culture tells me that my identity is what I do. In other words, my identity is based on my performance. Everything in life, whether it's our job, whether it's on the field, uh, so much of our life, we are defined and we get either rewarded or penalized based on our performance. So that's what culture tells us. My identity is what I do. The first thing you ask someone oftentimes when you meet them is what? What do you do? So we are so hardwired to think about that. So my performance then gives me my worth, good or bad. Whereas the Bible says, no, 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 your identity is not based on your performance. It's based on who God says you are. And it's based on, if you're a follower of Jesus, Jesus's performance for you. So those are two very fundamental differences. Sadly, though, even if you're a follower of Jesus, we can know that, but we still allow ourselves to be defined by what we do.
Yeah, and I think from a parenting standpoint, we inadvertently reinforce the wrong things. We like when we are focusing so much, especially like think about the car ride home. When we're focusing so much on like you could have done this, or I'm so proud that you did this, or like we make our comments very performance based, which is a natural, easy thing to do because we just watch their performance.
Yeah.
And so what that subconsciously does to the kid is, oh, I performed well. Mom and dad love me more because I performed well. Oh, I didn't perform well. Mom and dad are criticizing me in the car, and so they don't love me as much. Doesn't make as much sense to our adult brains, but to human brain, or to kid brains who are still developing as adolescents, that's just the way it connects. So the thing that we can do instead of that is talk about like, I had so much fun watching you because you're my kid. It has nothing to do with their performance. I told Owen, our 8-year-old, he did a run club over the winter, and you've seen Owen. Owen's not built like a runner. It's just not. It's not the way he and I are built. And I'm his soccer coach, and so I don't get to go out and just watch him play or practice or perform or whatever. And there was one day we were coming home from run club, and I told him, I was like, dude, I really like being your coach, but I had so much fun just watching you be you, just getting to be dad and watch you out there. And he kind of sheepishly smiled from the back seat. He goes, I love you being my coach, which felt great to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's like,
That's awesome.
I wanted to emphasize that I just loved being dad and I loved watching my son go be my son. I didn't care how well he did at practice or running. I didn't care that he wasn't the fastest kid. I was excited to watch him do something that he wanted to do because he's my kid.
Yeah. I would, I'm just thinking as you talk and thinking about, so let me remove the guilt and shame of anybody listening to this that says, holy cow, I've done everything wrong. So
We all
I,
have. We
right.
all.
So as I mentioned when I introduced myself at the beginning of this, that so Lori's a high achiever and I'm a high achiever. So you've got two people, and we're both firstborn, so that may have something to it if you're into that birth order stuff. But so we naturally create in our household, if we're not careful, that Pereiras achieve things. And man, there's been times where I have not done well with
Hey, I'm
that.
going to
But
interrupt real quick. I'm going to
yeah,
interrupt. For those of you who are Enneagram fans, Johnny is a hardcore Enneagram 8. Just
yes.
he is that bulldog like that will go after stuff. So with that context, finish your story,
Yeah,
Johnny.
yeah, yeah. So if you're an 8, you love that. If you're not an 8, you're like, oh my gosh, I may stop listening right now. So here's I've had to think of, man, how do I be super intentional with this? And then take a step back, even from that and what I'm doing with my kids, and saying, man, and you touched on it when you asked the question. Is there something about me that I am trying to find my identity in how my kid performs? So taking the focus even off of what I need to reinforce with my child and take a step back and say, wait a minute, is there something in me that's actually, you know, getting some sort of identity for how well my kid performs? Because wrestling with that subconsciously is going to affect the pressure that you put on your child, which just brings us back to, man, I've got to remind myself, man, my identity is who God says I am, not what, hey, I want my
Our
kid to be a,
identity is not in how well our kids perform on the field or
yeah,
on the court.
yeah. So I've had to be disciplined to say, I mean, just some practical things, hey, and I think actually this may have been on something that I saw when I was listening and watching one of your podcasts in the past from one of the coaches you've had on. Just the different words of "I'm happy for you" or "I had fun" when they, if they I'm happy for you if you perform well, but I'm proud of you for who they are. I'm proud because you're my kid. I'm proud of how hard you worked out there. And we've actually had to be intentional because we were finding ourselves, man, we were taking the kids out for ice cream when they had a good game or posting a pic on social media when they had a good game. And we had to say, holy cow, what are we emphasizing here? So actually, even though they may not have liked it in the moment because they were upset how they played, hey, we're actually going to go get ice cream. And they had a terrible day. And let me just post a pic on social media of you and just say, man, I'm so proud of Lucas or Lily being my kid or being a good teammate. So those are just some simple things, because here's the thing. You are telling them what you value by what you choose to celebrate. We celebrate what we value. And so that's going back to what you even said too. That's why you want to celebrate them, not celebrate how they performed. Because once again, your words only mean so much. It's actually what you do. And so those are just some things that, frankly, I wish this podcast existed, which I don't think podcasts existed when my kids were 5 and 6, but nevertheless. So if I can have any minute um, way of maybe helping some others out from a parent who's actually lived this, whose kids are now, as I said, 17 and 20, then man, I'm glad I can do it.
So your kids are 17 and 20. We're going to switch gears a little bit here because you joked about it the first part. Lily's out of the house.
Hmm.
Lucas has, when this comes out, Lucas will graduate in a month. So
Yeah,
I'm just
crazy.
putting you on edge for that because I felt like doing that because
Hmm.
you know I enjoy stuff like that. So Lucas graduates in a month. Lily is out of the house, and a big part of what I share on here is that we are not trying to create the best athlete today, but rather we're raising adults who have every tool they need to be successful in life once they leave our house. You've gotten to see Lily out of the house for almost 2 years now. Lucas is about to leave, and a huge part of preparing them is giving them ownership of the journey and giving them opportunities to make mistakes on their own. So I know you have thoughts, just life in general, about giving kids chances. But when you put your
Hmm.
pastor hat back on, from a faith development standpoint, how do we help our kids take ownership of their own spiritual journey before they leave home? Because you and I both know that the biggest time kids walk away from their faith is within those first 5 to 7 years after they leave home. So how
Yep.
do we set them up for long-term success in their faith outside of their athletics?
Um, Yeah, so I'm going to say something that sounds like literally I'm contradicting myself before I say anything. Um, so here's the reality. There's no magic formula that's going to guarantee that your kids are going to follow in your footsteps with your faith. That's a lot of prayer, but there are steps that we can take to be as intentional as possible. Um, and so I just think that's important. Sometimes your kids, there's a period of time where they walked away from their faith and everything, and you can persecute yourself, so to speak, and think, man, if we would have done this, would have done that. And the reality is none of us are perfect. That's a decision that is our kids. And so that's why I said it sounds like I'm contradicting myself. So, and I'm not trying to be pessimistic either. So let me now go. But I just know I want to be sensitive to individuals who may have children that are out of the house and they may be struggling with that. So, um, but let me also talk about intentional steps that once again we did. So I've talked a lot about what you value. You value what you celebrate. I think you also value what you choose to spend time doing with your kids. So going back to the conversation right on Sundays. So you can have your kids go to church every single Sunday. And I believe that we're to be connected to a local church. I can go into theological reasons for that. But I can press into that and be at church every time the doors are open and never do anything with my kids outside of that time and miss the boat completely. Because when you think about it, those people who are watching your kids, investing in your kids at church, they might have your kids for an hour and a half on a Sunday. And depending on how many times your church does church, I mean, me, I don't know about you, Jonathan, it was Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. So, but even with that, okay, so what's that? 4 hours in a week? And so even in that, even in those extremes,
It's
so it's
literally
really,
1% of the week.
yeah. So
Like,
what are you doing to spend time with your kids that hopefully reinforces what they're getting on a Sunday morning? So for our kids, and granted, I can't say this enough. Lori and I have countless times missed the boat on this, lest anyone think that we did it swimmingly. But Lily, we just tried to really take, for us, once again, for us, man, family dinner was super important for us. Did we do it every single time? No, but we really tried. That was a rhythm in our house because so many conversations happened around that wasn't just about let's open up our Bibles and let's pray, but just about life in the car traveling. For me, one of the things that somebody who was a mentor of mine told me to do, I took my kids on a 13-year-old trip. So when they hit 13, I'm not Jewish by any means, so it had nothing to do with a bar mitzvah. But when they were 13 years old, because that's what the guy who mentored me did, I took them on a special trip with dad and just spent time with them and we had conversations and things like that. I really made sure that, we have some discipleship tools at our church. So how can I use those at home with my kids and reinforce what they're getting? And really what you're doing with your kids, to use a farming analogy, which I'm not a farmer, but is you're just planting
a lot of
seeds.
farms down there in Orlando.
Yeah, yeah, no farms, yeah, yeah. Some orange grows, but just planting seeds. That's what you're doing because you can't predict the harvest, but you're just planting seeds and you're praying as you plant those. And knowing that probably someone else is going to come alongside and water and things like that. What's awesome, I'll speak for Lily first and then Lucas. So Lily's a sophomore in college. She's not going to a Christian college, by the way. Um, and so she has a speech class this spring, and she had to give a speech on something personal. So she chose to talk about her experience as a pastor's kid, to which made Lori and I shudder at first. But thankfully, it was actually something positive. So she just shared, 5 minute speech. Well, somebody in that class came up to her who she already knew. She was an acquaintance and said, something, Lily, something that you said in your speech, man, I've been wanting to explore faith. And could we meet? Well, because Lily already knew how to use, you know, one of our journal that helps people know how to read the Bible and pray. Because she had already used that on her own, she was like, yeah. So she met with her at a coffee shop, and she was like, man, this makes so much sense. Now another girl is doing that. So my point is there's no formula, but for us, man, that was super encouraging to us, way more than whatever she does on the court. That, man, some of the things that we invested have stuck. For Lucas, same thing as Lily. He was exposed to the same things. I did the 13-year-old trip, same conversations, all of that. But for Lucas, being a guy, and I could, that's a whole podcast. Just the the culture that we're now in, and prolonged adolescence, and what does it mean to be a man. And I read this book by John Tyson called Intentional Father that he had a huge impact on me. So I actually wrote what I call the Pereira Manual. And it basically is, I wrote like a, for lack of a better word, curriculum, which that makes it sound way too intense. But it was basically, what do I want Lucas to know about life? What do I want him to know about God? And what things do I want him to know how to do? And the thought process was, I need to think of my son when he's 18 years old, walking out the door and thinking, have I prepared him to be a man in this world? And so we've been doing that together. And I wrote a devotional that uses our Bible reading and prayer tool. And we've been meeting every week for that. And then we're going to memorialize that. I may offend some people. We're going to memorialize that because he wants to get a tattoo. So we're going to memorialize that by some tattoo that symbolizes something of, hey, you're prepared as a man to go in this world. So those are just some examples that are just, for me, really your kid's spiritual journey. It's really about, man, are you spending intentional time with them? And taking advantage of that. Man, we run our kids to sports everywhere, right? And we move heaven and earth to make sure they're involved in everything. So I would just say, man, be as intentionally are with those things. Man, just be intentional to just think of how I can spend time with them. And if you're involved in a church, like what things are they getting wherever they're at that I can actually reinforce in the home, and then people aren't going to like, the other pastors aren't going to like. And if your church doesn't do that, then go find another church.
One of the things that I told Olivia, our 9-year-old, like she's joining a softball or soccer team in Winston this spring, and she's doing we're recording this at the end of February, but she's doing an art class in Winston as well. So I told her last week, the first week, I was like, hey, this is the first week for the next 3 months. You're stuck in the car with me for an hour every week. I hope you enjoy it. Just poking at her. But like, we haven't, because it's a 25-minute drive each direction to practice and to the art class. And then after practice, once it starts up, there's a pizza place right around the corner. And so she's so excited to have pizza and practice every week. And so
Yeah.
we're gonna spend probably an hour to an hour and a half, the two of us on our own, for a solid 3 months. And I have the choice leading up to that. Do we just sing Taylor Swift songs together on the drive, which we will do
Yeah.
enough of, and I will sing badly and I will
Oh,
annoy
yeah.
her, and
My
she'll
daughter is a Swiftie, so I know that.
Liv says that I am mid-sus cringe. That's what she calls. So I've turned that into a song to make it even worse. But I can either do that the whole time, or we can actually have conversations.
Hmm.
And at her being 9, like the conversations are only so deep, and they're probably
Hmm.
5-minute conversations. Where when you and Lily were traveling around for a summer going to tournaments, the car rides you had with her at 17, 18 were a lot probably deeper than we're going to have at
Yeah,
9. But the foundation for those conversations starts at 9 years old.
that's
And
exactly right.
5 minutes at 9 turns into an hour at 18. And so
Hmm.
wherever you are on the journey, however old your kids are, like an intentional 5 minutes now leads to intentionality and having the relationship, so that when the stuff does hit the fan later, because it's going to, your kids are comfortable with you to come and talk to you about those things.
Yeah, yeah, you said it. That can't be set. That needs to be on repeat over and over again. I mean, as a dad whose kids are 20 and 17, I'll be honest with you. The thing that has meant the most to me that I mean, granted, there are different conversations that we have now, and we really love, man, we loved like those older teenage years with our kids. I know a lot of parents have horror stories, man. We loved them. And we do love them. It's not over, but, um,
It is for Lily. She's 20.
yeah, yeah, she's 20. She's not a teenager anymore, but I mean, you can never get that stuff back. And so to me, I remember the conversations when we were going to the YMCA when you had to wear a wristband, you know, when you were playing, and so the wristband symbolized, okay, we're going to match up your daughter with, and they did guys and girls together back then, and this boy, and they seem to be close to the same skill set, so you don't have one kid get burning the other kid every possession. But I remember those days and just the sweet, like you said, the little conversations, because what you're doing, that's when you are enforcing the most, when they're in that young age, back to identity, that their identity is who they are, not what they do. And man, those are sweet times. The dad who now is looking in the rearview mirror to those, I remember that stuff way more than whatever game they won or how well they played. That's the stuff that if I could bottle it up and drink it every day, I would.
All right, we don't have too much time, so I'm telling a pastor he's got to have short answers here. So I know the issue with that. The question I've started asking towards the end of every episode, I end every episode with these same two questions. For someone who's been there, you're further on the journey than I am, than a lot of our listeners are. What's something I need to ask you about, or something you feel like you need to tell that we haven't talked about, whether it's faith or whether it's just youth sports in general? What's something that you feel people need to hear that we haven't talked about yet?
Yeah. So you gave me this question before, so I actually really thought about it. So um, I'm just going to give these bullet points. Number one, don't do travel ball too early. And when I say travel ball, I mean the things that has you going on weekends and, spending all this. I mean, just expose them to a lot of things, um, but don't compromise the values you want to instill in them. Second, it's important to remember that youth sports is a business. So don't forget that. So there's a lot of people who want to make money more than invest in your kids. And no one, this is a key piece, no one will care for your child and what's best for them more than you or God. So no one, and that's not anything against coaches. I'm thankful for the girls and the guys and individuals who invested in my kids. But no one's going to care for them more than you or God. In other words, I know what's best for my kid. And that also is determined by what we value. So if your goal is a scholarship for your kid, then here's what you can do when they're, 9, 10 years old, and you're going to save a lot of money. Invest in a 529 when they're young, because you're going to spend way more money if you're doing the travel ball circuit when they're 8, 9, 10 years old and going everywhere. At the end of the day, youth sports, you got to remember youth sports is a business. That sounds ugly and nasty, but I just think you got to keep that in perspective. And that doesn't mean you don't have your kids in sports. And I would say this: you can't want your kids to play sports more than they do. And then lastly, man, they're going to be athletes for a short amount of time, but they will be adults for the majority of their life. And you are their parents first. And don't forget that. And you have a responsibility to love God and to love others and to invest that and to teach that to your kids. So you're a parent first and foremost. And Jonathan, you've said it over and over again in this podcast. It's really the purpose of it, I think, is man, it's so much more than about whatever their athletic career looks like, whether that ends at 9 or whether that ends at 23 or whatever it is. So those are just some things that every one of those topics I think you're going to deal with or have dealt with. But let me just affirm what everything that I've seen on this podcast that is so, so important, because man, you can get caught up in the guy who says, hey, I see this in your kid. They're 9 years old. And if you come and let me train them for $400 a month, then man, just slow the roll. So Those would be just some things. And then just the last thing, man, enjoy the process and don't obsess about the uncertainty of the destination. I Man, I remember when Lily was wanting to play college. I remember struggling with such anxiety at times. Like, man, the amount of money we spent in this, she reclassed. Like, is this going to work out? And I got some really good counsel from some individuals that had gone before me that just helped me to say, I got to enjoy the process and I'm not going to obsess about the uncertainty of the destination. If that's your story right now watching this and that's your child, and that's a hard thing to do, but so that would be what I want to leave everybody with, Jonathan.
It's almost like you knew what the last question was going to be and went ahead and jumped to the encouragement just because you
Yeah,
were on a roll and wanted to keep going.
yeah,
Johnny, thanks so much for joining us today. We
yeah,
appreciate it.
absolutely. Thank you, Jonathan.
That's it for today. If you like the show, I'm going to invite you to subscribe on your favorite podcast app or on YouTube. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, it'd be a huge help for you to write up a small review. If you're on YouTube, make sure to hit that like button as well. If this episode has helped you in any way, the best way you can help us grow the show is sharing it with a friend. Most of all, we hope you have a great week. Have an incredible Easter with your family, and we'll talk to you again next week. Have a great week, everybody.